Hi, everybody. My name is Patrick Hyland, and on behalf of Remesh, I am delighted to host this discussion on the intensification of work, which is a relatively common experience, but it's often unexplored in organizations. For many employees, this has been a challenging year. If you have attended any of our webinars to date, you know that there are these multiple external factors. We've investigated new technology. We've talked about political environment. We've talked about economic volatility. We've explored how all these external factors are impacting the employee experience, and we've learned quite a bit. What we want to do today is we want to look within the organization, and we want to look at characteristics that are making the experience of work more intense for employees. So as we discuss this important topic, I am delighted to be joined by workplace author and expert Melissa Swift. Melissa, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it is great to be here. And Patrick and I had a blast working on this data, and hopefully that comes through as we share it.
Yeah, it really has been a rich experience, I think, for both of us as we have designed the research, conducted the research, analyzed all the research. And I'm just so delighted that we have you with us because Melissa will be bringing all of her experience working with organizations, I think, to really highlight a couple of things. How do you identify when employees within your organization are experiencing the intensification of work? What can you then do in organizations, either as an employee or as someone running an organization, HR, business leader, to manage and mitigate work intensification before it leads to things like high levels of stress, mental health issues, burnout, and ultimately attrition. So that's our plan for today. We'll be chatting for about 40 minutes. We will make time at the end for Q&A. If you do have any questions, by all means, feel free to enter those into the chat. We are also recording today's conversation, and we'll be sending this out after. So if you need to drop or if you need to pass this on to colleagues, by all means, please do. So with that in mind, here is our agenda for today. Just like webinars that we've been conducting today, the first thing that we think is really important is we want to put the current context of work in perspective. We really want to take a look at what's happening real time in 2025 from an employee experience perspective and how that relates to work intensification, what that concept is, and how we can use that to really understand employees right now. We'll then take all of that context and we'll talk about the research that Melissa and I designed, and then the data that we collected in late April to really understand from an employee experience, what are the factors that are causing employees to experience an intensified work experience. And then I'll hand it over to Melissa and she'll really highlight some of the findings that go beyond just the surface level, high level understanding of the data that I'll present, and also her expertise about what do we do with these important findings and nuggets. And like I said, we'll take questions at the end, but if you really do have a question along the way, feel free to type those into the chat, and Gabby will help us surface those and talk about those. So with that in mind, and Melissa, as I do this, by all means, feel free to interrupt, feel free to jump in, and I will be asking you along the way a couple of questions as we sift and sort the data before we get into your deeper dive into that.
Fantastic. Lots to talk about.
Lots to talk about. Okay. We'll talk a little bit more about ourselves. I'll start, Melissa. I know that originally I was going to let you go first, but I'll just for flow. It's nice to be with you all. I am Patrick Hyland. I'm an organizational psychologist. I am a strategic advisor with Remesh, and so really, what I have been doing over the last 6 months is helping our clients and prospects understand how this platform can be used to do rapid employee research. How can we explore emerging complex topical issues like work intensification? And so it's been a pleasure to be with all of you over the course of these webinars as we've explored really complex emerging topical issues. Melissa, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself, your background, and how that all relates for today's conversation?
Well, today's conversation, this is very, very much on brand for my company and what we do. So I'm the founder and CEO of Anthrom Insight, and we're a company that really focuses on effectiveness at work, be it organization level, team level, individual level, and always contextualized to a world of work that's gotten just a lot more challenging. Right? There are all of these complexities and challenges, intensification that we're going to talk about today, a more technology inflected world, right? So how do you be effective in the midst of all that? And Anthrom uses a lot of data to get there. So this is exactly the kind of conversation I love to have. And my background is after spending a number of years in corporate consulting, working for large organizations like Korn Ferry, Mercer, and Capgemini, as of the beginning of this year, started Anthrom Insight, and it is a fun entrepreneurial journey. And I wrote a book in 2023, Work Here Now, and I may or may not be working on the second one, which may or may not touch on some of these themes. So very excited to be with you all, very excited to be working with Patrick. Again, that's one of the great joys of entrepreneurship is you come back together with some of the characters from previous seasons. So we're thrilled to talk through this research with you. We hope you find it actionable.
Yeah, thank you so much. And so much of what you wrote about in your first book worked its way into the design of this research. And many of the questions that I think took us beyond kind of the high level understanding of some of these issues and problems around work intensification, and really started to identify what can organizations or employees do to push back against or manage work intensification. That's what I found so helpful and fascinating as we did this.
That's a question that I always get because people say, okay, once now that you've explained work intensification, oh my goodness, this explains a lot of other things. Okay, great. What do I do? So that's become a huge focus for me in my work, my writing, my research. Okay, to your point, how do we kind of get this monkey a little bit off our backs?
Right, right. Because as we'll see, as we jump into the data, many of us are experiencing this, but many of us don't have the label to understand it or to say, this is what I'm experiencing, or the skill set to navigate that. So that's what we'll talk about today. And as we did this research, we were talking before we got started, there were some surprises for us. So hopefully we'll be able to surface those surprises as we looked at the data and talk about that. And we would love to hear back from the audience in terms of what surprises them, what questions they have, and how they're managing this, either in their organization or in their personal lives. So with that in place, so thank you for that introduction and context. Let's put things into context. So look, we're all living this, but sometimes when you see the data, it becomes a bit more apparent, and maybe it helps us to feel a little bit more normal about our own journeys at work. If you look at recent polls, and I'm talking about 2025 polls from various organizations and research institutions, what we're seeing is relatively high levels of stress. The first study from Census-wide conducted in the first quarter, all these are from the first quarter of 2025, they found that 66% of American employees are experiencing some form of burnout. Gallup, also in the first quarter of 2025, found that 41% of employees said that they had experienced a lot of stress the previous day. And down at the bottom, Lyria Health found that 28%, 1 out of 4 employees, identify work-related stress as the top threat to their mental health. And these polls are very consistent with what we have been seeing here at Remesh as we've been doing our monthly webinars and exploring various aspects of the employee experience. Many of you are working in the HR space or as leaders, and you know how damaging stress is. I won't read through all the stats, but we know that stress creates quite a bit of challenges for employees, for organizations, and for healthcare systems as a whole. You know, I think what really stands out here is the estimated number of workers that are absent every day because of stress, according to the American Institute of Stress. That's a staggering statistic. And also down to bullet points, employees are losing over 5 hours of work a week as they grapple with their stressors. So
Yeah,
we are.
that's kind of popped for me because It's interesting because you see it in other fields of study too. So for instance, in Bob Sutton's work on, people acting like jerks at work, you see a similar phenomenon where if somebody has a bad interaction, they ruminate about it, right? They sit there and think about that bad thing that happened. And that's what's going on here too. It's not just the stress itself. It's like the meta effect of then sitting around and thinking about the stress. And this is why, it's so kind of painful.
Yeah. And then you think about all the spillover as we take all this home, right? So stressful environment. One possible cause of this is this concept of work intensification. Now, I'm an organizational psychologist, so this is an area as a whole that I study in terms of workplace stress and employee well-being. But work intensification was a relatively new construct that Melissa brought to me. And when we talk about work intensification, what we're talking about here, and Melissa, feel free to jump in because I know you have more experience and expertise here, but it's really a measure of the physical, the mental, the emotional effort that we invest in work. Many of you, if you're familiar with the engagement literature, would say, wait, that sounds a lot like employee engagement when we are investing ourselves physically, emotionally, mentally in work. But what we're talking about here is this experience of work that can be associated and driven by volume and pace, deadlines, emotional labor, interdependence. These are the antecedents that create this push into work. And researchers have found that work intensification is associated with a number of negative outcomes like stress, like anxiety, like mental health problems. A good recent reference down in the lower left-hand column. And again, we will be sending this deck out. As we were planning this, what really stands out is that there are many current drivers, conditions, factors that may be making work more intense for all of us. All the economic uncertainty that we're dealing with, both here in the US and around the world, the unprecedented number of layoffs, new technology, GenAI, return to office pressures, the skills race, and just this increased sense of competition for organizations as a whole and for individuals. These could all be amplifying the intensification of work.
Absolutely. And it's interesting to think about work intensification. I always think about it, we traditionally think about too much work like by size, right? Like there's just too much of it. Work intensification is also about density, right? It's packing too much into 1 hour of work, be it too much emotion, dealing with processes that are too interdependent. To your point, things like layoffs really create work intensification, because if you are suddenly doing the job of 3 people in the same amount of time you used to have to do the job of 1 person, right? You can work more and more hours, but you do run out of hours. And eventually what happens is each hour gets denser. And I connect this to some of the research that's shown, well, people are starting to try and actually work fewer hours. And my hypothesis is that the amount of density that used to be spread over, let's say, illustratively a 40-hour work week, people are now saying, well, I need to knock off early on Friday because I've already gone through the amount of density that would have fit into 60 hours historically, right? It's like if each minute gets heavier,
Yeah.
that has a real impact. And I think that's the picture that's painted on this slide, which is fascinating.
Yeah. So, as we think about this very turbulent start to 2025, we know that there are all these external factors, and those are hard to manage, but the spillover into our work experience and this whole idea that work could be becoming more intense was really what you and I wanted to understand as we launched into this study. And so we came up with 4 broad questions, given the unique challenges of the day, the current working environment. First, we wanted to get a sense of prevalence. To what extent are employees currently experiencing work intensification? The second thing, and you really helped guide a lot of the questions that starts to help us surface this, is what are the main causes? And then also, what are the consequences? And finally, most importantly, if we can get our hands wrapped around causes and consequences, what are some possible ways to mitigate the impact of work intensification? And this is where all your research from book 1 and possibly for book 2 started to really inform the questions that we asked. So with this in mind, and with these broad research questions, here's what we did. If you've participated in any of the webinars today, you've seen a slide like this. And just to give you context on what we did, we wanted to explore these broad research questions using a mixed method approach on the Remesh platform. So in late April, we iterated a couple of versions of this conversation, Melissa and I, as we put the study itself together. And then we used Remesh's Recruit and Live and Flex, which allows us to go out to a sample, in this case, of 1,000 employees working in 1,000 different organizations across multiple industries and jobs and demographic backgrounds. And look at all that. And if you haven't participated in a Remesh conversation, I encourage you to, because it is a unique mixed method platform that I always talk about as generating rapid insights. But you can ask open-ended questions, you can ask closed-ended questions. And when you ask open-ended questions, participants then see responses from other participants, and they're asked to say, to what extent do you endorse or agree with this statement? And that, for us as researchers, really gives us an extra level and layer of insight. So what we want to do over the next 10, 15 minutes is talk to you about the high-level findings, but just quickly in terms of the sample itself, pretty split between women and men, female and male respondents. We see that we had a healthy sample across generations, particularly from millennials and Gen Z. 28% were in non-management or individual contributor roles. The rest, the 72%, are across various levels of leadership, all the way up to the C-suite. And when you think about how big this database is, with 1,000 respondents, we really have healthy sample across all these levels of management. We found that they were working in a variety of industries, most heavily technology, 22%, hospitals and healthcare, 15%, education and research, and they came from a variety of functions. This sample is drawn mostly from US and UK-based organizations. So with that context in mind, let me walk you through the biggest findings in this mixed method study. And again, Melissa, feel free to jump in, but Melissa will be taking a deeper look at this data beyond kind of the descriptives of it. So the first thing we really wanted to understand is the prevalence rates. To what extent are we seeing in this cross sample of 1,000 employees a sense of work intensification? And so we asked, how often do you feel overwhelmed at work? And you can see the response options on the Likert scale over on the left. And what we found, big picture, is that 3 out of 4 employees in this research sample feel overwhelmed at least some of the time, right? And if you look at that data, you see pretty much a normal distribution, with 25% of respondents saying that they always or often feel overwhelmed, and 25% of the respondents saying we seldom or never feel overwhelmed. But I think overall what we're seeing is that this idea of the intensification of work hits many of us either all of our days at work, or many of our days at work, or some of the days that we experience at work. And over on the right, we wanted to start to get a sense of how this plays out across job levels. And so if you look at that data, which we have aggregated together, I think what stands out, and this is consistent with what we have seen at other webinars to date, is that the greatest amount of pressure and work intensification and stress seems to be coalescing right in that mid-level of management.
We're the group being hit by rifts right now, kind of in real time across a number of large organizations.
Absolutely, yeah.
So they're already struggling, and then that intensification is poised to become much worse, either through the stress of is a rift coming, or literally by taking on other people's work because the middle management ranks are being culled. So I think it's worth keeping an eye on that group.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about this, Melissa. When you compare those individual contributors against the C-suite, right? Now, we had a lot more individual contributors, right? But we did have a healthy sample of C-suite employees. And we see this gap, right? Especially if you look at the data on the far right, we're talking about a different experience. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, it's interesting because there are 2 possible explanations for that, right? Because we'll see a little bit later down in the data that part of what's going on is the higher up you get in organizations, the better you're doing in general to kind of fight work intensification. But there are 2 things that could be driving that. That could be that part of what happens as you get more senior in organizations is that you concretely get better at managing and pushing back on work, right? You acquire skills to do it. The other explanation, which is a little bit darker, is that, right, if you're further down the chain, you're not empowered to actively manage against work intensification, to say, okay, that process is a mess. You gave me more tasks than I can do. Why are you guys so emotionally messy, right? You know, that you, in the C-suite, you can look down from the mountain and say that as an individual contributor, you might not be empowered. So it's a very open question to me, right? Where that sort of a dissonance in experience is coming from. And the reality is it's probably some of both, but I think looking at that perceptual gap is super important. And we're going to see it play out in factors like motivation and things like that as well, again, deeper down in the slides. Because fundamentally, if you're sitting in the C-suite and you really do not understand the experience of these folks down here, you can't solve for the business problems you're trying to solve for, because you literally kind of don't get what their working days are like.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, right? They either may be more skilled or stress may roll down the organization, but either way, this gap, this perceptual gap, unless that is made explicit, we have people in the same system having dramatically different experiences, right? And that can create even more tension, I would guess, and more potential work intensification.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very good point. And I think also the main takeaway that, look, probably makes sense to look for high levels of stress right in the middle of the organization, especially right now, also stands out. We then asked people, and this is where I really find the power of the Remesh platform, its ability to do mixed method analysis and the ability of the tools in the platform, driven by GenAI, natural language processing, where we can make sense of open-ended data. We asked, what causes you to feel overwhelmed at work? And we received a whole bunch of comments from our 1,000 participants. And you can see right up top, when we coded those within the platform, we see that the two big ones that jump off the page is high workload and tight deadlines. Very consistent with what you find in the academic and practitioner literature here, right? No surprises at the top of the page.
There. I mean, it is a bit sad in an era of such incredible technological enablement that we're still being kind of crushed by just the volume of work. There's something, it's kind of like on the Jetsons, you know, where George's only job is to push a button and he's still getting stressed out, right? That I think it bears some examination that we have not managed to better offload tasks onto technology. So what's going on there?
Yeah. One thing that jumped out to me, and we talked a little bit about this, is the relatively low prevalence or rate of comments having to do with balancing work and personal life. I would have guessed that right at the top of the page, when it talks about being overwhelmed, it's managing all of this inside and outside the
I'll
organization.
give you my cynical explanation, which is that work has become such a problem that it is even dwarfing work-life balance as a problem. That that's what happens when overwhelm gets to a certain level. It's like, okay, that's just not even the problem over here. And it's not that this problem got smaller, it's that this one got bigger.
Yeah. Got it. So, we start to get a sense from employees across all those different levels. And what's so interesting is we were able to dig deeper into this. And this really, I think, is where your expertise and your experience helped, because I think it also is from a mixed method perspective, how we can go from quantitative to qualitative and back to quantitative. Because what we wanted to understand is, on the previous page, here's your explanation, but here are a whole bunch of reasons. Here are 8 reasons why people may feel overwhelmed at work. To what extent do you have any of these experiences? And what we did, if you remember a couple of slides ago, we had that nice bell-shaped curve. We had 25% who feel always or often overwhelmed. You can see their data in that first column. There were 250 of those employees. And then we had just about the same number, 244 employees, who said that they seldom or never feel overwhelmed at work. And we were able to look at their responses to each of these 8 typical issues associated with feeling overwhelmed at work. And we were then able to sort this all by differences. And as we looked at this, and as I looked at this, it seems that those employees who always or often feel overwhelmed are experiencing a lot more hassles in terms of managers that don't prioritize and bureaucratic tasks, and a lot more anger at work than their peers who are seldom or never overwhelmed. The volume is pretty similar for both of these populations. You see that down at the bottom of the chart, and being distracted by people competing for my attention. Pretty similar, but
Yeah.
those others, those are some notable gaps.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, I'm remembering the level by level data on my managers don't prioritize enough. It's pretty much an issue until you get to the C-suite. So good work, the board, right? Because you're apparently prioritizing well, but starting with the C-suite, it's like each layer of management is not doing enough to prioritize for the layer below them. It comes through really, really clearly in the data. And I think that there's something there about not feeling, the common thread to these is not feeling adequately shielded, if that makes sense. But the anger and the excess tasks, it's like you're not prioritizing, you're not keeping the rein off me in terms of things I shouldn't be doing, and you're not keeping the rein off me either in terms of being impacted by others' emotions.
Yeah.
This feeling of being vulnerable and unprotected, that's kind of the red thread to these findings, and that's what's driving being overwhelmed. And that, again, that's interesting to me because that's actionable, right? It's not ethereal. It's like people need a shell and boundaries around them. And that's something organizations can go out there and do. That's not pie in the sky.
Yeah, yeah. Fascinating too, because that was one of the themes that emerged in an earlier webinar as it related to employees in the external environment. There was this sense that they needed the organization to shield them from all the chaos externally. And you're saying, look, same idea internally. How can we not allow the chaos to run the ship and intensify my day?
Absolutely.
So let me move us through a couple of slides because I do want to turn things over. I think the dialogue has been super rich, but as you would expect, when employees feel overwhelmed, their motivation and their personal sense of effectiveness declines. Here we're comparing the percent agreeing on these two diagnostic questions across these three groups. I never or seldom feel overwhelmed. I'm sometimes overwhelmed, and I'm always or often overwhelmed. And you can see on the far right that those employees who are always or often overwhelmed, their motivation levels and their sense of personal effectiveness so much lower, significantly lower than their peers in those other conditions, as you would expect. How do you cope with this? And so when we asked employees, what coping techniques or strategies do you use, again, through an open-ended question, and you're going to dig more into this, Melissa, as we get into the back of the deck. But what we see here are some strategies that I think many of us employ: short breaks, task prioritization, deep breathing, going for a walk, breaking tasks into smaller steps. As you look across these content categories that emerge from the qualitative data, and you look at some of the most endorsed comments over on the right, I found them breaking into two or maybe three broad topics. One is about, I'm going to rearrange the tasks at work, right? Two seems to be about, I'm going to rearrange kind of my relationship to the environment.
Yeah.
And then three is going inside. I'm going to be doing some deep breathing or meditation. And you see some of that in some of the comments. Melissa, you're going to talk more about this, but how do you, as you advise around this or make sense of this, what are the basic strategies that people use?
I mean, I think you've nailed them. I think the interesting thing is one of those three strategies, two out of those three have to do with the individual, right? Kind of the self-care and then the meditative thinking. And I like seeing, by the way, we saw in the open ends an array of meditative strategies. Like some people talked about using prayer. And I thought that was really neat because sometimes we tell people in organizations, well, here's like the one meditation method that you got to use, and then they can't count the rest right. And then they're like, meditation failed, right? And we saw an array of meditative strategies being effective, which I thought was fantastic. But meditation, self-care, that's about you. Working on the work is about how you engage with the organization. And that's why I'm going to highlight some data a little bit further on that really looks at that, because that's a bit of the frontier we haven't explored enough yet. The meditation and self-care are incredibly impactful. I don't want to denigrate the impact of those, but you got this other category that we should be really interested in too.
Right, right. It's funny because we wrote a paper on mindfulness all the way back in 2015, and it was appreciated by many and critiqued by others. And some of the strongest critiques were, look, you're taking a toxic system as a whole, and you are trying to detoxify it by giving people some additional skills. Why don't you focus on detoxifying the system as a whole? And I thought it was very helpful feedback. As I bring my section, just painting the broad picture to a close, again, a great question driven by your research and expertise, but we talked about, or we asked respondents about what they do concretely when they feel overwhelmed. And there were 3 strategies that you introduced. Do you reduce or manage the amount of tasks I have to complete? Do you break things down? Do you reduce or manage the amount of emotions that are at work, or do you work independently? And we have these rank ordered over on the left, and you can see that 8 out of 10 employees are either reducing the amount of tasks when they feel overwhelmed or reducing the amount of emotions. Lower percentage somewhat finding more ways to work independently. Over on the right, what's so interesting, and this goes back to your question about skills or empowerment or agency, you do see dramatically different responses at the top of the organization and the bottom. So I think this starts to become very interesting.
And I have a theory, by the way, about that work more independently piece, why it's less popular. I
Mm,
think that's something that's taboo within organizations. I think, we tell people you need to collaborate all the time. If you're not a collaborator, you're antisocial. And, you and I have been talking about this figure-8 model of collaboration. It's actually the right way to do collaboration, where you work together, then you come apart and work independently, then you come back together. We are not giving people enough space, but we're also giving them cues that it's not okay to work independently. And that's intensifying work. The idea that you need to kind of sit on top of everybody all the time and do all your work together is not actually the way to get work done, and it is the way to drive intensification and burnout. So I think that's part of why I think people are literally loath to admit that they need to go off and work independently. Certainly.
I think that's a really great point. And I know that as we collaborated together, it was so helpful that we weren't spending all of our time together, because I think it would have been a very intense experience and probably less productive. So
Not productive at all. Yeah.
very helpful. The important thing is that what we're seeing in the data is that when you do use these 3 coping strategies, the more of them you use, the more motivated you are going to feel, and to some extent, the more effective you're going to feel. So here we have, we took all those employees and we broke the 1,000 employees into those who are using none of the 3 strategies we just talked about, or 1, or 2, or 3, and we looked at their responses to motivation and sense of effectiveness. And those motivation scores really dramatically different. So there is this benefit, this subjective benefit to using these strategies.
Absolutely. Yeah. And now we're gonna dig in a moment to what happens when you're a real super fan of the strategies, because I think there's some exciting findings there.
Wonderful. So let me turn it over to you, Melissa.
All right, so let me talk about some deeper implications. So this is I think Patrick has given you a wonderful context for our overall findings. Let me dig into, on the next slide, just some specific kind of what else did we learn. So this is going to be 6 kind of quick points that I'll run through. 2 of them about sort of the overall schema, and then 4 about particular populations. We had some really interesting, again, because this was such a big and varied sample, we had some really interesting conclusions. So maybe we could just, in the essence of time, go right to the first one. I'll talk through each one. All right, so this is fascinating. A meaningful fraction of the segment, about 1 in 8 folks, strongly agreed with the idea of doing all 3 strategies, right? So this is like your top, 1 month, right? Strongly agree. Reducing your task load, reducing interdependence, and reducing emotion in the work. And so the interesting thing is we took those guys and compared them to everybody else, right? So people who, might agree, might disagree, might be neutral, right? If you're a super fan, you are 119% more likely to feel highly effective than the rest of the folks. And there's something interesting there about, because again, we're looking at strongly agreeing, we're highly effective. That group, and again, it's a large number of people, it's 1 in 8 folks in the population, really kind of have their afterburner. They see themselves, they're 4 times as likely to see themselves as highly motivated. But they're also 4 times more likely to see themselves as always feeling overwhelmed. And Patrick and I have been kind of obsessed with this particular set of data points. because there's something very interesting in a group with perceived high effectiveness, perceived high motivation, and somehow just feeling really overwhelmed all the time. And I think it said something about the impact of those strategies is that if you feel like you are doing something about the things that are broken at work, right, it gets you through a lot. So this is a group that we're kind of obsessed with, right?
Just quickly, Melissa. So the ability to be highly motivated, highly effective, and highly overwhelmed.
Well,
The fact that you can manage all those could be very good, possibly for you if you can pull that off. I wonder about how that affects the people that report into you. I wonder about how that affects the people that you interact outside. You just don't
absolutely.
know, but I
And it
would.
comes back to some of those cascading effects, right? Of my boss isn't prioritizing for me. Well, my boss isn't prioritizing for me, right? So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff here, but I think it does speak to the impact of those strategies, right? That it is absolutely worth doing those things. All right, so then another interesting, kind of when we're looking at these open-ended answers as to what people cited as causing them to feel overwhelmed. So you see on the left what we just talked about, you saw those tons of responses, high workload, task volume, tight deadlines. And then we used in the remesh tool some of the AI capabilities to, okay, well, what are the other buckets, right? Can you summarize some of the other buckets for us? And so there was one bucket, about 13% of responses were just about crummy management. Right? Just like my boss doesn't support me, priorities aren't well set, poor communication, micromanagement, lack of recognition. These are just like old chestnuts of bad management. And organizations spend money on that. They spend a lot of money fixing that. But then there were two buckets that organizations don't focus on as much and don't traditionally invest in as much. One was stressful coworkers, responsibility for other people's mistakes, teams fighting with each other, conflict with individuals. That's a meaningful source of feeling overwhelmed. And another one is just work being a hot mess. Multitasking, unexpected emergencies, inconsistent workload, interruptions, right? As I'm listing this off, I'm probably triggering some of you because we've all seen this. And those were really interesting themes that kind of popped out that, again, organizations often don't focus on and don't address. So we wanted to surface those as, again, kind of worth thinking about. On the next slide, this fascinated me. So the C-suite and senior leadership are almost 2.5 times more likely to always feel overwhelmed than the rest of the organization. So we saw in aggregate, they are less likely to feel somewhat overwhelmed, but a higher proportion of those folks always feel overwhelmed. So again, you've got this subsegment that's very interesting. And so what's overwhelming them? It's literally the number of tasks they have to complete. They're 15% more likely than others to report a high volume of work. And 66% of those self-reported reasons for feeling overwhelmed were like tasks and time, not the complexity of managing a large organization, the emotional demands of a large team. No, it was like, I have too much stuff to get done. So 3 quick hypotheses. Number one, work has just gotten harder and jobs up the chain have just require more skills and more doing. So the work has just gone back up the chain. Number two, the fall of the administrative assistant and the rise of tech self-service has literally just given them more administrative tasks. And number three is perhaps we haven't invested enough in that layer just below senior management and they are underskilled and that is literally sending tasks right back up to the layer above them. So fascinating findings about kind of what's going on at the top that we wouldn't expect. The next slide, we talked about this a bunch. I'm not going to belabor the point, but individual contributors are far less likely to really consistently deploy these strategies. When you look at individual contributors, they're a lot less likely to strongly agree with any of the 3 strategies, right? Between 46% and 52% less likely, depending on the strategy. And as a consequence, they're 39% less likely to see themselves as highly effective, and they're 140% less likely to see themselves as highly motivated. And so, if you think about that, there's a really interesting dynamic there because it's markedly different from anybody in a management role. So again, do we need to empower folks or do we need to upskill them? Open question. But I think what pops through in the data is if they were doing these strategies to combat work intensification, their working lives would be better. Gen X, that's a topic close to my heart. fascinating data. They're 66% less likely to always feel overwhelmed, 20% more likely to see themselves as highly effective, and 45% less likely, and this is really interesting, to feel like they need to bring the emotional temperature down. But they were 21% less likely to report being highly motivated. And that's interesting because every other group that felt effective pretty much felt motivated. Gen X is the outlier. So there's something interesting going on there with, are they kind of, Gen X is often accused of sort of putting up a front and like burying their pain. And are we seeing the consequences of kind of burying that pain here in that sapped motivation, despite other things actually okay? And then finally, a little inspiration on tackling intensified work, maybe from the finance function of all places. So when we looked at a proportionate basis of those strategies, the managing the work versus mindfulness and self-care, the finance function was proportionally a lot more likely to actually try to manage the work and the task load and the interdependence and all of that, as opposed to all the other functions. So I think there's something interesting there. Again, it's not a don't do mindfulness and self-care. Those are fabulous strategies, but it may be worth doing a little bit of what the finance function is doing. So I'll just quickly get to in the final slide, like what do we recommend you do? All right, so two sets of things. One, organizations and teams, and one for individuals. So at organization and team level, you've got to address workload. Right? This stuff about the work is what it is. The work is not what it is. Right? We can work on the work. Number two, look at creating more independent work. I think the Rob Cross research on collaborative overload from some years ago really said something. We have collaboration problems. Figure out ways to help people work more independently. Number three, to the point that Patrick and I were discussing earlier, dig in with senior leaders about the experience of work. Are they overwhelmed by tasks? And do they understand how different their experience is from the front line? And then empower and upskill everybody, but especially those ICs, to fight work intensification. Again, bringing down tasks, bringing down emotion, and working more independently. So then you're going, okay, Melissa, this is great. I'm not the CEO of my company. What do I do? Okay. So number one, take stock of which of these elements might be affecting you. Is it tasks and workload? Is it emotion, right? Like not feeling shielded enough from people's being angry and upset? Or is it that you feel that you can't work independently enough? Number two, actively strategize and get your manager's help, right? This is a legitimate conversation to have with your manager. I'm going to do these things to manage workload. What do you think? And then if you manage people, talk to them about this stuff. I think sometimes, again, we have a taboo about, if you talk about work intensification, it means you're not really, leaning in. Well, no, it would drive productivity. It's all good things for the organization. It's good things for the individual. So if you're the boss, start a conversation on it. All right, so I will hand back to Patrick to close us out. I think we have one question in the Q&A.
Wonderful. Yes, please. I know we're 2 minutes away from our time, 45 minutes, and Melissa and I are happy to stay on for a couple extra minutes if any of you would like to stay and ask questions. If you do have questions, by all means, please put them into the chat. We will be sending out this deck and a recording of it. So if you have questions that follow today's presentation, by all means, please do. The question in the chat, I can't see, but I know it came in.
So it was about imposter syndrome at senior levels, and could that be related? And I do think that may be related to some of these, particularly kind of some of the skills issues, is that it is just, I think, harder and harder to feel good at your job as a senior leader. And I hear this from senior leaders across organizations all the time. I mean, Patrick, you and I were talking about this the other day. I'm doing the things I used to do and they don't work anymore. That is a recipe for imposter syndrome. And I think it is worth looking at this issue of, has work gotten more difficult and challenging? And you're not wrong. Your job is harder, and that is making you feel not so great about your performance at it, even if you're still the same wonderful senior leader. So I think it's a great connection to make.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. And I think it's a great working hypothesis, this connection between the imposter syndrome and I'm super motivated, I'm really effective, and I am super overwhelmed. So I think it's a great working hypothesis. As we start to wrap up, any other questions, please feel free to type in as Melissa and I think, bring together some final thoughts. A couple of things that stood out, Melissa, as you were working your way through your section, and thank you for taking that deeper look at the data. And thank you for all of it. I mean, just helping to organize this and develop all the research questions. But there were two things that stood out. You were talking about the individual contributors and Gen X, right? And the idea that came through for me, especially, and I am Gen X, in this post-pandemic world, this idea of work centrality, I think, becomes very important. And I think for many people, not just in Gen X, but maybe across generations or life stages, could be either, right? Because you were talking before about, look, some IO psychologists and psychologists say we shouldn't be looking at generations, and a lot of practitioners say we should.
Right.
So,
open question. Yeah.
Open question. But this idea of work centrality, I think, becomes important, that work is potentially for some people not quite as important as maybe it was earlier in their career. I wonder to what extent that might be in that Gen X data. And then the second thing that stands out is we've talked about this. We talked about really the fact that many overwhelmed employees are struggling with the mess and the chaos of the work and the people they work with. And it made me think about, there's a relatively new construct. I am not expert in it, but it caught my eye, about health promoting leaders. And the basic idea, as I understand it, is there are some leaders that help me feel healthier in the way that they lead me, and some that are really going to stress me out. And so either of those,
intuitively, it checks out.
right,
For
right.
sure. Absolutely.
And as you hear any of those ideas and anything that either resonates, you want to pick up on, or anything else?
I mean, I would say part of what's interesting, and that a kind of a red thread in what you've been talking about through our conversation today, is impact on the individual versus then how they behave out as a leader. So, let's say I am highly motivated, feel effective, but I'm highly overwhelmed. Am I maybe managing the team that I manage in a way, to your point, that is not health promoting, even though my own afterburner is on, like, let's go. And it may be that Gen X is, some proportion of them are sitting, again, back to the idea that it's not generational, that it's about role or life stage or whatever, are sitting just below a senior management layer that's on overdrive. And feeling the impacts of folks who are quietly quite overwhelmed themselves, right? So that's part of what's interesting, is there's, nobody's on the sidelines in this game. Everyone is affecting everyone else's sense of overwhelm as well.
Yeah.
Part of what makes it so interesting to study and to work on.
Yeah, wonderful. Love it. Well, listen, thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you for all of you that attended today's webinar. We really hope you enjoyed. I'll do going once, going twice, and see if any other questions pour in. But as I give you all that time and space, please do send us a note if you have any questions about today's research, or how you can work on and mitigate work intensification in your organization. Melissa, thank you so much. I do think I see, is that the same chat? Let me just take a look. Nope, I guess that's it. And for those of you who have been following our webinars, look forward to our next one, mid to late June, and we'll talk about how we can really conduct rapid research in our organizations to understand these really emerging complex topics. But with that in mind, Melissa, thank you so much. Audience, thank you, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you, Patrick. This was a blast, and I think we've only scratched the surface of this data.
I think you're right.